So in the last video I did on the channel, I was talking about Massa and the lawsuits surrounding the 2008 season, so I thought, why not keep today's video themed to that season, but talk about something nice that happened that year, away from all the carnage, away from all the controversy, away from all of that, and talk about one of the 4 races that weren't won by a McLaren or a Ferrari. Yeah, alright, the car was Ferrari powered, but it's still a nice little underdog victory. So then, some background. I love these bits because we get to go through a nice little recap of what happened up to this point. It's a refresher for those that were there and just general info if you weren't. Formula 1 was heading to Monza for the Italian Grand Prix, fresh off the back of the latest batch of controversy as Massa had won the Belgian Grand Prix. Hamilton was given a time penalty for cutting the chicane and getting an advantage, and it meant that Massa, who had been anonymous all day, got the biggest break he would get all season. As a result of this win that is still hotly debated to this day and formed a good chunk of the comments on the previous video, Massa's gap to Hamilton ahead in the championship had shrunk to just 2 points, and with Ferrari's home race coming up, expectations were high. Ferrari had been doing some testing at Monza in between the Belgian and Italian Grand Prix and felt that the straight line speed was adequate enough to potentially beat McLaren, and if they could win at home in front of the Tifosi at Monza, then it would be a great boost to their championship hopes, because Ferrari was going for the double-double and McLaren was still trying for a drivers' and constructors' title 10 years after their previous one. Massa also wanted a consistent race after the iffy weather at the previous one, and McLaren in the hands of Hamilton had won, he'd crossed the line first in all 3 wet races that year, with Lewis winning at Monaco, where Massa suffered from a Ferrari pit stop blunder. Basically, they pitted for dries too late while Hamilton had been in 2 laps earlier, and then there was Silverstone where Hamilton lapped virtually the entire field, and there's the already mentioned race at Spa. McLaren had actually appealed the decision to give Hamilton that penalty. It had turned a 15-second win into a 10-second deficit behind Massa, and put Hamilton down to 3rd. Felipe Baby wasn't going to get his wish though. All 3 practice sessions were wet, and the only time the teams could run dry tyres was a brief spell during the 2nd practice session on Friday afternoon. This messed up the timings a little bit. In the first session, Adrian Sutil was quickest, about a full second faster than Barrichello and Fisichella, all 3 drivers not expected to be at the pointy end of a timing sheet. But this was all dependent on actually being able to go out and do some driving. 6 drivers didn't set times due to the weather getting so bad. In the final session, the times were jumbled up again. Hamilton last, 11 seconds off Timo Glock, who was fastest. And that wet weather carried on over into qualifying. It was many wet, with times getting slower over the course of the afternoon because the rain just kept intensifying. At this time in Formula 1 history, the current knockout qualifying session format was in effect, so the usual 3 sessions with a top 10 shootout being the centrepiece, if you will. Kovalainen went fastest in the first session, but it was Sebastian Vettel that shocked everybody by going fastest in the second session, 100th or so faster than Heikki. Then, in the 3rd session, Vettel put the fastest time in again, a 10th faster than Kovalainen, with Webber, Bourdais, Rosberg, Massa, Trulli, Alonso, Glock and Heusinkveld rounding out the top 10. Sir of Blessed was down in 15th after he'd gone out on the wrong tyres for the 2nd qualifying session, and in turn finished last of the drivers that made it through into Q2. He and his engineers thought it would be a good idea to go on to the full wets when it was actually intermediate weather. It's just that Lewis didn't have much grip, but it was not a good idea. And Lewis basically said, it is what it is. It was a joint decision to go out on wet weather tyres at the start of the 2nd session, partly mine and partly my engineers. We thought it was the right way to go at the time because it was getting drier, but the grip level was so poor I came in and switched to extremes. It's the first time this has happened to me in Formula 1, so I can't really complain. Vettel had actually changed his setup for qualifying. On Friday he couldn't get to grips, literally and metaphorically with the car, but whatever they changed on the Saturday, it seemed to work, and he would become, at least at the time, Formula 1's youngest ever pole sitter. The Toro Rosso, called Julie, was low drag and had a powerful Ferrari engine in the back, which you wouldn't think would do so well in these conditions, but something must have worked because Bourdais was 4th. Okay, he was 9/10 off Vettel, but he was in 4th. But you had Vettel, Webber, Bourdais and Rosberg in unfancied cars, all out qualifying Massa, Raikkonen and Hamilton. And because it was tipping it down on the Sunday, the race had to start behind the safety car, which would have no doubt eliminated any nerves from Vettel, because imagine starting for the first time from pole in torrential conditions at the fastest circuit on the calendar. Toro Rosso's day was dampened, no pun intended, by Bourdais' car stalling on the grid, and when they finally got it going, he was a lap down. The safety car was only out for about 2 laps. When it came in, Vettel was able to get off into a half-second lead ahead of Kovalainen. On the next lap, that gap opened to 2 seconds, then 3.7, then 5.2. By the time lap 8 ended, the gap was 6.3 seconds. Now, Hecki later admitted that he was fully expecting to win this race, but couldn't work out how the Toro Rosso was going so fast. And this is something I've been all over the internet trying to figure out. As we've already established, Julie was low drag. So a low drag setup at Monza in the rain, it doesn't seem like it would be the thing to do, but it must have worked. The Toro Rosso must have just worked in those exact conditions with all the stars aligning, if you want to call it that. So all that's left really is that Vettel just needed a surgical right foot. It was the first season without traction control. So, yeah, doing well not to spin it out on the exit of the first chicane and the Lesmos. But then again, the Toro Rosso had performed very well for a few races that season. At the previous round at Spa, the cars were running in the top 6 for the majority of the race before the carnage of the last 4 laps or so kicked in, and ultimately Vettel would be 5th and Bourdais 6th. The STR3 had been introduced at the Monaco Grand Prix that season, and immediately Vettel scored a 5th place, following that with an 8th in Canada. Now Monaco was also damp, so it must have been something to do with the conditions. Hamilton and Raikkonen meanwhile were trying to charge their way through the pack. On lap 11, Hamilton got past Raikkonen for 11th, while Massa overtook Rosberg for 4th. Then on lap 19, Hamilton had managed to get up to 7th and into the points. Vettel had pitted on lap 18 with Kovalainen, Webber and Massa coming in 4 laps later. Coulthard tried to swap to intermediates on lap 28, but he slid straight off at the first chicane. A few drivers, including Alonso and Kubica, as well as Hamilton, were trying one-stop strategies, while others were trying 2, as they tried to work out what the weather was doing. Then, all at the end of lap 35, Kubica, Webber and Raikkonen set fastest laps. The weather was still very much on Vettel's side. When Hamilton pitted, they were certain the rain was going to come back, so they put him back out on the full wet weather tyre and fueled him to the end, expecting it to chuck it down again. Whereupon he'd be in the prime seat to get past Vettel and lead the race once Vettel had pitted for the full wets. At this point, Vettel and a good chunk of the rest of the grid were on the intermediates, which worked much better in the current conditions, and since the rain never came like McLaren was expecting, Hamilton was at a disadvantage. McLaren's weather forecasting was also hampering Kovalainen, and the gap was at such a point where if McLaren had to bring in either of the 2 cars for intermediates, Vettel could just pit for some new ones on the next lap and cover it all off. He was fueled fine. All he had to do was keep it on track, and couldn't understand why his pit board was still showing him in first place. He couldn't believe it either. Massa was still circulating ahead of Hamilton, which was crucial for his championship hopes, but he was still in 6th, despite at one point being as high as 4th. He had been in a proper tussle with Rosberg's Williams, eventually getting past on lap 15, but the strategies of others around him saw him slip backwards, and the conditions were making overtaking difficult. McLaren just got the forecast wrong, and Hamilton would, in the end, have to pit for the intermediate tyres on lap 37, which would eventually see him finish 7th overall. Ahead of him, Massa was battling Heusinkveld, and the Brazilian would cut across the second chicane twice, allowing Hamilton to close in. By lap 38, Hamilton was lapping over a second a lap faster than Vettel, while other drivers started setting fastest laps as the track was starting to ease off on the wetness. But the rapid times Hamilton had been pumping in to get back into the race after that second stop had taken their toll, as he had to back off as the tyres were past their best. But at the end of lap 53, all eyes were on Sebastian Vettel in a Toro Rosso, who would win the 2008 Italian Grand Prix by 12 seconds from Kovalainen's McLaren. Kubica, who had done a one-stopper, was 3rd, with Alonso doing the same one-stop strategy, finished 4th. Heusinkveld was 5th, Massa 6th, Hamilton 7th, and the rest of the top 10 being Webber, Raikkonen and Piquet. In 11th was Timo Glock for Toyota, who had been involved in a bit of handbags with Hamilton during the race. Glock felt that Hamilton had unfairly squeezed him into the first chicane, almost forcing him off the track, or on the exit of the first chicane, almost forcing him off the track. I can't find the footage. But basically, he said words to the effect of, Hamilton drives like he's the only person on track, and he's not going to get any help from me in the future. He's not going to get any help from me in the future. He's not going to get any help from me in the future. Not going to get any help. That's not foreshadowing, that's 25 shadowing. But let's be honest, the day was all about Vettel and Toro Rosso, and the underdog win in the middle of a hotly contested Drivers' Championship battle, and the fact as well that this team used to be Minardi, the perennial back markers that very rarely scored points, but when they did, they would celebrate like they just won the championship. The team that had given breaks to the likes of Pierluigi Martini and other Italian drivers. There's also Jarno Trulli, Giancarlo Fisichella, Anthony Davidson, Mark Webber and Fernando Alonso. There are more drivers that Minardi brought in. I haven't forgotten any. This is just a sample. It also meant that the sister team to Red Bull had won a race before Red Bull would. But that's fine. Vettel would just do that next year. It was when Vettel announced his arrival in Formula 1. They said he would win more, and he did. 52 more races as it so happens, and a total of 4 world championships. Kid Seb evolved into Ruthless Seb, who then evolved into Uncle Seb. The evolution of Vettel, if you want to call it that. It's also the first win for an Italian-based team at Monza since 1957 when Fangio did it for Maserati. It's also the only time a Ferrari customer engine car has won a race. That's mad. But it also leads into these two nice bits of information. For Vettel, it was a dream come true. The German national anthem followed by the Italian national anthem, just like he heard weekend in, weekend out while watching his hero Michael Schumacher. And now they're doing it for him for his first Grand Prix win at Monza. And also, prior to the 2010 race in Abu Dhabi, Seb discovered that his race engineer Rocky had written Monza in massive letters on his balaclava to remind him of what he was capable of under pressure. Vettel won the championship that weekend. At the end of the season, Toro Rosso had scored a total of 39 points, which meant they finished above the senior Red Bull team, and Vettel would be off to that same team for 2009, where if things had been ever so slightly different, he could have won the title that year, if not for Braun's early season advantage. But then, 11 years later, Toro Rosso, now under the guise of AlphaTauri, would win a Grand Prix. The first Grand Prix win for Pierre Gasly. At Monza. It's amazing how all this adds up, isn't it? As for the championship standings, Massa's deficit to Hamilton was just 1 point with 4 races remaining. McLaren would have been left wondering what would have happened if they put Hamilton on the right tyres in qualifying, while Ferrari must have been lamenting the fact that Massa was only 6th, while slower cars were finishing ahead. But still, 4 races left. The next one of those being in, let me just check my notes, Singapore. RIP. But the day was all about Vettel and the underdog Toro Rosso team, dumping one on McLaren and Ferrari. He kept his head, while the others lost theirs. So then, a look at when a rebadged Minardi won its first ever race and announced the arrival of F1 star of the early 2010s. If this has brought back some memories or taught you about this specific event, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And for more like this, subscribe with the bell on so you never miss out on a future video. Massive thanks to the patrons and members of this channel, and if you want to support me on a more personal level, there is a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord and socials, and then there's the join button under this video too. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to buy me a pasty. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.